I woke up in a hospital bed 6 months after a car accident that should have killed me, and the first words I heard from my stepson Michael were not, "I'm so glad you're alive," or "We thought we'd lost you," but "When are you getting out of here because the house is a mess and I need you to handle it?" I was lying there with tubes still in my arms, my body so weak I could barely lift my head off the pillow, my throat raw from the breathing tube they'd just removed that morning, and this 28-year-old man who I had raised since he was 7 years old, who I had fed and clothed and put through college with money from my own inheritance, was standing at the foot of my hospital bed with his arms crossed, looking at his watch like I was inconveniencing him by nearly dying. The fluorescent lights above me were too bright and made everything look washed out and unreal, like I was trapped in some kind of nightmare I couldn't wake up from, and I could smell that distinct hospital smell of disinfectant mixed with something sour and medicinal that made my stomach turn. I tried to speak, but my voice came out as barely a whisper, and he didn't even lean in to hear me better. He just pulled out his phone and started scrolling while he talked at me about how the cleaning service quit because nobody was there to manage them, and how I'd need to take care of hiring a new one as soon as I got home. My hands were shaking against the thin hospital blanket, and I could feel tears burning behind my eyes, but I was too shocked, too confused, too weak to even process what was happening. This was not the boy I raised. This was not the child who used to crawl into my lap when he had nightmares and tell me I was the only mom he ever needed. But what Michael didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have anticipated while he stood there treating me like hired help instead of the woman who had sacrificed everything to give him the life he now enjoyed in my mansion, was that 6 months in a coma had given me something he would never understand: time. Time to listen to every conversation that happened around my hospital bed when people thought I couldn't hear. Time to absorb every cruel word, every dismissive comment, every plan they made thinking I'd never wake up to stop them. And what I did when I finally got out of that hospital, when I was strong enough to move the pieces I'd been planning in my mind for months, didn't just shock them. It destroyed everything they'd built on the foundation of my assumed helplessness. And I savored every single moment of watching their faces when they finally realized that underestimating a woman who survived death itself was the biggest mistake they would ever make. Before I take you through every calculated step of how I dismantled the life they'd stolen from me while I fought for mine in that hospital bed, if you're tired of watching good women get used and discarded, if you've ever felt invisible in your own life, if you've ever been treated like your only value was what you could do for other people and never who you actually were, then subscribe to this channel right now and turn on all notifications. Because this channel is dedicated to real stories of women who stopped accepting crumbs and started demanding the respect they deserved all along. Women who use their intelligence, their patience, their life experience to serve justice so precise and so devastating that it restored your faith that actions actually do have consequences. What happened to me and what I did about it will show you that it doesn't matter how long you've been silent, how long you've been taken for granted, how long people have treated you like you were disposable. The moment you decide enough is enough, everything changes. Hit that subscribe button and notification bell right now, because what comes next in my story is just the beginning of understanding what a mature woman with nothing left to lose and everything to gain is truly capable of achieving. Let me take you back to before the accident, before the coma, before I discovered that the people I loved most in the world saw me as nothing more than a convenient ATM and household manager. My name is Victoria, and I was 51 years old when my life as I knew it ended on a rainy Tuesday in March. I had married Richard when I was 32, and he was 40 with a 7-year-old son from his first marriage. Michael's mother had left when he was 3, just walked out one day and never came back. And Richard was struggling to balance his demanding career as a corporate attorney with raising a young child essentially alone. I was working as an executive assistant at the time, making decent money but nothing extraordinary, living in a small apartment and honestly feeling like my life was going nowhere particularly meaningful. When I met Richard at a charity fundraiser where I was helping coordinate the event, he seemed kind and overwhelmed and genuine, and Michael was this sweet little boy with big brown eyes who held my hand at our second meeting and asked if I was going to be his new mommy. I fell in love with both of them, or at least I fell in love with who I thought they were, who they presented themselves to be when they needed something from me. We got married 8 months later in a small ceremony, and I moved into Richard's comfortable but modest 3-bedroom house in the suburbs. and I threw myself completely into being the mother Michael had never had, and the wife Richard claimed he'd always dreamed of finding. I quit my job 6 months after the wedding because Richard said it made more sense for me to be home with Michael, to be there when he got off the school bus, to help with homework, to manage the household so Richard could focus on building his career and making partner at his firm. It seemed reasonable at the time. It seemed like what families did. I didn't realize I was giving away every ounce of independence and power I'd spent my 20s building. Here's what nobody tells you about becoming a stepmother to a young child, about sacrificing your career and your identity to build someone else's family. The more you give, the more invisible you become. I spent the next 19 years of my life making sure Michael had everything he needed and most things he wanted. I was at every soccer game, every parent-teacher conference, every awards ceremony. I packed his lunches with little notes telling him I was proud of him. I stayed up until midnight helping him with science projects and college application essays. I taught him to drive, spending hours in the passenger seat with my heart in my throat, while he learned to navigate traffic. I nursed him through every cold and flu, sat with him through every heartbreak, celebrated every achievement like it was my own. I used my inheritance from my parents, $75,000 they'd left me when they died in my late 20s, to pay for his college education at a private university because Richard's firm was going through a rough patch, and he said we couldn't afford it otherwise. I told myself it was an investment in Michael's future, that this was what mothers did, that the money meant nothing compared to seeing him succeed. Richard made partner when Michael was 12, and suddenly we had money. Real money. He bought us a mansion in the most exclusive neighborhood in the city. 6 bedrooms, 8 bathrooms, a pool, a 3-car garage, everything that was supposed to signal that we'd made it. But with the mansion came longer hours at the office for Richard, more business trips, more dinners with clients that I wasn't invited to because I didn't fit the image of the polished attorney's wife who had her own career and achievements. I was just the woman who managed his household and raised his son. I planned elaborate dinner parties for his colleagues and their wives, staying up for 2 days preparing everything perfectly, and Richard would barely acknowledge my effort, except to point out that the wine selection could have been better, or that I'd seated someone in the wrong place. I kept thinking things would get better when Michael went to college, when it was just Richard and me again, when we could reconnect and rediscover why we'd fallen in love in the first place. But Michael came back after graduation, moving into the mansion's entire west wing with his girlfriend Amber, a 24-year-old influencer who treated me like I was staff from the moment she walked through the door. She'd leave her expensive clothes scattered across the guest bedroom floor and then complain to Michael that I hadn't picked them up and put them away properly. She'd use my car without asking and return it with the gas tank empty. She'd invite friends over for pool parties without telling me, and then act annoyed when I didn't have enough food prepared for 15 unexpected guests. And Michael, my sweet Michael, who I'd raised and loved and sacrificed everything for, never once stood up for me. Never once told her that I was his mother, not the housekeeper. He just shrugged when I tried to talk to him about it, and said Amber was going through a stressful time with her social media career, and I should try to be more understanding and accommodating. Richard was even worse. He started criticizing everything I did. The house wasn't clean enough even though I spent 6 hours a day maintaining an 8,000 square foot mansion essentially by myself. Dinner wasn't ready on time, even though he never told me when he'd actually be home. I'd gained 15 pounds over the years, and he made comments about how I'd let myself go, how I wasn't the woman he married, how maybe I should try harder to take care of myself. He started coming home later and later, sometimes not until 2 or 3 in the morning, smelling like perfume that wasn't mine, and making excuses about client dinners and work emergencies that didn't make sense if you thought about them for more than 5 seconds. I started to feel like I was disappearing, like I was becoming less substantial every day, like I was fading into the expensive wallpaper and marble floors of this mansion that was supposed to be my dream home, but felt more like a beautiful prison. Then came that Tuesday in March that changed absolutely everything. I was driving home from the grocery store, my car loaded with bags of food for a dinner party Richard had informed me about that morning for 8 of his colleagues coming over that evening, and I was tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion. I was tired of being taken for granted, tired of being invisible, tired of giving everything and receiving nothing but criticism and demands for more. The roads were slick with rain, and I was sitting at a red light, And I remember looking at my hands on the steering wheel and noticing how old they looked, noticing the age spots and the veins too close to the surface, and the wedding ring that suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The light turned green, and I started through the intersection, and the last thing I remember was the sound of screeching tires and the sight of headlights coming at me from the side. Too fast, too close, unavoidable. Then everything went black. They told me later that a drunk driver ran the red light doing 60 miles an hour and hit my car directly on the driver's side. They told me I was clinically dead twice in the ambulance. They told me I had a severe traumatic brain injury, multiple broken bones, internal bleeding, and that I probably wouldn't survive the night. But I did survive. I survived that night and the next and the next. Stuck in a coma that the doctors said I might never wake up from, existing in some strange space between living and dying, where I couldn't move or speak or open my eyes, but I could hear everything. Here's what they don't tell you about comas, or at least about the kind of coma I was in. Sometimes you can hear, not all the time, not clearly, not everything, but sometimes voices would break through the darkness like radio signals cutting through static, and I would catch pieces of conversations happening around my hospital bed. In the first days, I heard Richard's voice, and he sounded genuinely upset, genuinely scared, and I felt something like hope bloom in my chest, even though I couldn't move or respond. He was saying things like, "Please don't leave me and I can't lose you and I need you." And I thought maybe this was it. Maybe almost losing me would make him see me again, would make him remember that I was a person who mattered and not just a convenient household appliance. But then I heard another voice, a woman's voice I didn't recognize, soft and concerned, asking if he was okay, if there was anything she could do. And Richard said, his voice dropping to something quieter and more intimate, "I just need you right now, Sarah. This is all so overwhelming." Sarah. I didn't know anyone named Sarah. And then I heard sounds that made my stomach turn even in my unconscious state. Sounds of kissing, sounds of whispered endearments, and I realized with a clarity that cut through the fog of my coma like a knife that my husband was bringing his mistress to my hospital room while I lay there fighting for my life. The hope that had bloomed in my chest withered and died and turned into something cold and hard and unbreakable. Over the following weeks and months, I heard more, so much more. I heard Richard on the phone with his lawyer, asking about how long he had to wait after I died to access my life insurance policy, $1 million policy I didn't even remember signing for, but apparently had. I heard him discussing with Michael how they'd sell the mansion and split the money, how they'd finally be free of the burden of taking care of me, how this was tragic, but maybe also a blessing in disguise, because I'd been so difficult lately, so demanding, so unlike the easy accommodating woman I used to be. I heard Michael and Amber in my room one afternoon, and Amber was laughing. That specific cruel laugh that still makes my blood run cold when I remember it. And she said, "I can't believe we have to keep visiting her. It's so depressing. She's basically already dead. They should just pull the plug and be done with it." And Michael, my Michael who I raised and loved and sacrificed my inheritance for, said, "Yeah, but Dad says we have to keep up appearances for a while, make it look like we care, and then when she finally dies, everything will be ours, and we won't have to pretend anymore." I heard Richard's mistress Sarah visit once, heard her tell him she was tired of sneaking around, tired of being the secret, and Richard promised her that soon, very soon, he'd be free, and they could be together openly, and she could move into the mansion as the new Mrs. Patterson. I heard the nurses talking when they thought I couldn't hear, saying it was sad how rarely my family visited, how when they did come, they seemed more interested in talking to the doctors about prognosis and likelihood of recovery than in actually sitting with me or talking to me or treating me like I was still a human being in here somewhere. Every word, every conversation, every casual cruelty was like a drop of acid slowly burning away the person I used to be and forging something entirely new in her place. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't cry, couldn't do anything but absorb it all and let it transform me. Something inside me that had been soft and warm and trusting for 51 years turned to ice in that hospital bed. Not the ice that melts, but the ice that burns, the kind of ice that preserves and sharpens and makes you dangerous. I realized with perfect, crystalline clarity that I had spent 2 decades of my life playing a game I didn't even know existed, playing by rules they made up specifically to keep me powerless and grateful and small. I had confused their need for my service with love. I had mistaken their tolerance of my presence for appreciation. I had believed that if I just gave enough, sacrificed enough, loved enough, they would eventually see my worth and love me back the way I loved them. But they never would. They never could. Because they didn't see me as a person. They saw me as a function, as a role, as something that existed to make their lives easier and ask for nothing in return. And now they were sitting around my hospital bed like vultures waiting for me to die, so they could pick my bones clean and move on with their lives without even a backwards glance. That version of me, the one who believed in unconditional love and family and doing the right thing, she died in that hospital bed during those 6 months. And what was being born in her place, cell by cell, breath by breath, heartbeat by heartbeat, was someone they should have been absolutely terrified of all along. And right here, I need to stop and talk to you directly, woman to woman, heart to heart. Have you ever given everything to people who treated you like you were nothing? Have you ever poured so much of yourself into others that when you finally looked in the mirror, you didn't recognize the exhausted, depleted woman staring back at you? Have you ever had that specific moment of clarity, maybe in the middle of the night or in a quiet moment alone, where you suddenly saw with brutal honesty that you'd been loving people who didn't love you back, serving people who didn't appreciate you, sacrificing for people who saw it as your obligation rather than your choice? If you're sitting there right now feeling that burn of recognition in your chest, that mixture of rage and grief, and something that feels almost like relief, because finally someone is saying out loud what you've been feeling in silence for years, I want you to do something powerful for yourself right this second. Write in the comments, I choose myself from now on. Just those 6 words. This isn't just a comment on a YouTube video. This is your declaration to yourself, to the universe, to every single person who has taken you for granted and assumed you'd always be there no matter how badly they treated you. This is you drawing a line in the sand and saying, not anymore, never again, I'm done. When you write those words and hit post, you're not just helping yourself. You're helping every other woman scrolling through here at 3 in the morning, unable to sleep because she's finally admitting to herself that she deserves better, who desperately needs to see that she's not alone, and that choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's survival. Write it now. I choose myself from now on. And let that be the first brick in the foundation of your new life. Thank you for trusting me with that declaration. Now let me show you what happened when I finally woke up and chose myself for the first time in 20 years. I woke up on a Thursday morning in September, 6 months and 4 days after the accident. The doctors called it a miracle. They said patients with my level of brain injury almost never regained consciousness, and if they did, they were usually severely impaired, unable to speak or walk or remember who they were. But I woke up with my mind sharp and clear and completely intact, every memory preserved, every overheard conversation cataloged and filed away for future use. I was weak physically, my muscles atrophied from months of lying in bed, my body thin and frail in a way that shocked me when I finally saw myself in a mirror. But my mind had never been stronger. The first few days were a blur of tests and physical therapy evaluations, and doctors expressing amazement at my cognitive function. Richard visited once during those first days, staying for exactly 14 minutes according to the clock on the wall, and he seemed almost disappointed that I'd woken up, though he covered it quickly with a mask of concern that didn't reach his eyes. He asked when I'd be coming home and told me they'd managed fine without me, but the house really needed my attention now. Michael didn't visit at all. When I asked about him, Richard said he was busy with work and would come by when he had time. The nurses were kind and patient as I slowly regained the ability to walk and feed myself and handle basic tasks, and I played the role of grateful, confused, weak woman perfectly because I needed them to underestimate me just a little bit longer. They released me from the hospital 3 weeks after I woke up, and Richard picked me up in his Mercedes, barely speaking to me during the 20-minute drive home, except to warn me that the house was a bit messy because the cleaning service had quit and nobody had time to properly manage the household in my absence. A bit messy was an understatement that would have been funny if it hadn't been so insulting. I walked into my mansion, the home I had maintained meticulously for almost 2 decades, and found it in a state of chaos that made my jaw actually drop. Dishes were piled in the sink and covering the counters, some with food so old it had fossilized. The trash was overflowing and smelled like something had died in it. The floors were sticky and stained. The bathrooms were revolting, toilets unflushed, towels moldy on the floor, makeup and products scattered everywhere. The living room looked like a tornado had hit it, with clothes and shoes and empty food containers covering every surface. Michael and Amber's wing was even worse, a disaster zone of discarded designer clothes and empty champagne bottles and evidence of parties I hadn't been conscious to witness. I stood in the foyer with my small hospital bag in my hand, still weak and shaky from my injuries, and Richard looked at me expectantly and said, "Well, I know you're still recovering, but you should probably start getting this cleaned up. We have people coming over this weekend. Not we should hire someone to help. Not let me help you. Not I'm sorry we let it get this bad. Just the assumption that cleaning up 6 months of their neglect was my responsibility and mine alone." That night, lying in my bed in the master bedroom that smelled musty from months of neglect, I started making my plan in earnest. I had learned so much during those 6 months of listening, so much they never intended for me to know. I knew about Sarah, Richard's mistress, a 34-year-old paralegal at his firm who he'd been seeing for almost 2 years. I knew about the life insurance policy Richard had taken out on me 18 months before the accident, a policy with him and Michael as equal beneficiaries. I knew that Michael had been stealing from the household accounts, small amounts at first, but increasing over time, thinking I wouldn't notice. I knew that Amber had been using my credit cards to fund her shopping addiction while I was in the hospital. I knew that Richard had told his colleagues I was probably going to die, and he was already making plans to marry Sarah within a year of my death. I knew that they'd discussed selling family heirlooms that had belonged to my parents, items with sentimental value that they saw only as dollar signs. I knew everything, and they had no idea I knew. That was going to be my greatest weapon. The next morning, I started playing my role. I got up early despite my exhaustion and started cleaning the kitchen, moving slowly because my body was still weak but steadily making progress. When Richard came down for breakfast, he seemed surprised to see me up, and I smiled at him weakly and said I wanted to start being useful again, wanted to earn my place in the house. I saw something flicker across his face. Satisfaction, maybe, or vindication, and he patted me on the shoulder like I was a dog who'd performed a trick and told me that was good, that he was glad I understood how things needed to be now that I was back. Michael appeared around noon with Amber, and they dropped a bag of dry cleaning on the kitchen counter and told me to make sure I got it done by tomorrow because Amber needed her clothes for a photo shoot. I said of course I'd take care of it right away, and Amber looked at me with barely concealed contempt and said to Michael, loudly enough for me to hear, "At least she's finally being useful again." I smiled and nodded and took the dry cleaning, and inside I was cataloging every insult, every dismissive gesture, every moment of disrespect, adding them to the mountain of evidence I was building against them. Over the next 2 weeks, I played the perfect combination of grateful survivor and submissive household manager. I cleaned their messes without complaint. I cooked elaborate meals that they barely acknowledged. I did their laundry and their shopping and their errands. I listened to them talk about me like I wasn't in the room, discussing how the accident had made me more manageable, less difficult, more like I used to be in the old days. Richard started staying out later again, clearly feeling comfortable resuming his affair now that I was home and functioning. Michael and Amber treated me like hired help, leaving notes with chores they wanted done, never saying please or thank you, just assuming my compliance. But while I was scrubbing their toilets and washing their dishes and maintaining their comfortable lifestyle, I was also doing other things. I was making phone calls from my car while I was supposedly running errands. I was taking photos of documents I found in Richard's study when I was cleaning. I was keeping detailed records of every credit card charge, every withdrawal from our accounts, every expense, and every pattern. I was reaching out to old friends I hadn't spoken to in years, people I'd lost touch with during my marriage because Richard said they weren't the right kind of people for us to associate with. I was consulting with professionals who owed me favors from decades of kindness and generosity. I was slowly, carefully, methodically building my case and moving my pieces into position. The breakthrough came 3 weeks after I got home from the hospital. I was cleaning Richard's study, something I did every Friday, and I found a folder tucked into the back of his filing cabinet behind his tax returns. Inside was a copy of the life insurance policy and paperwork about the accident investigation, and something that made my blood run cold even though I'd suspected it. Emails between Richard and a private investigator, dated from 2 months before my accident, with Richard asking about how one might stage an accident that would look natural, how one might ensure a fatal outcome, what the police typically looked for in suspicious vehicle incidents. The investigator had apparently refused to help and warned Richard that what he was suggesting was illegal, but the intent was clear as glass. Richard had been planning to kill me. The accident had been real, caused by a genuinely drunk driver who was now serving time for vehicular assault, but Richard had been actively trying to figure out how to make my death happen right before random chance did it for him. I photographed every page with my phone, my hands steady even though my heart was racing, and put everything back exactly as I'd found it. That night, I made a call to James McAllister, a lawyer I'd known from my working days before I married Richard. James had been a junior associate back then, fresh out of law school and struggling, and I'd helped him get his first major client through a connection from my boss. He'd told me once that he owed me his career, and if I ever needed anything, I should call. I hadn't spoken to him in almost 20 years, but I still had his number. And when I called him from my car parked in the grocery store parking lot and told him I needed help, he told me to come to his office the next day and bring everything I had. James was a senior partner now at one of the city's most prestigious family law firms, and when I walked into his office and laid out everything I knew, everything I'd heard during my coma, every piece of evidence I'd gathered, the look on his face went from sympathetic to absolutely fierce. He told me we were going to destroy them. He told me we were going to make sure they never saw a penny of my money or my property. He told me what they'd done wasn't just morally reprehensible. Some of it was legally actionable, and we were going to use every single tool the law gave us to make sure justice was served precisely and completely. If you're absolutely gripped by this story, and you can't wait to see how I systematically dismantled everything they built on the foundation of my suffering and assumed death, make sure you're subscribed to this channel with all notifications turned on, because every single week I share real stories of mature women who stopped playing nice and started playing smart. Women who turned their pain into power, their betrayal into triumph, their invisibility into influence. This channel is your reminder that being over 45 doesn't mean being invisible or powerless. It actually means having decades of wisdom that younger people can't match, patience that comes from experience, strategic thinking that's been refined by years of navigating complex situations, and a level of I don't give a damn what anyone thinks anymore that is absolutely liberating and terrifying to people who are used to controlling you. Every story I share here is about women who reached their breaking point and decided that breaking point would be everyone else's problem, not theirs. Women who stopped asking for respect and started demanding it. Women who realized they didn't need permission or approval to reclaim their lives. So subscribe right now, turn on that bell, because the women in this community don't just survive, we dominate. We don't just get even, we get ahead. And I'm about to show you exactly how I did it. But I promise you'll want to be here next week when I share the story of a 53-year-old woman who discovered her husband had been slowly poisoning her to trigger early onset dementia so he could take control of her family business, and what she did when she figured it out will make my revenge look merciful by comparison. Hit that subscribe button now. James and I spent the next 6 weeks preparing. He brought in a forensic accountant who went through every financial record from my marriage with a microscope. We discovered that Richard had been systematically moving money out of our joint accounts into accounts in his name only, small amounts over years that added up to over $300,000. We discovered that he'd forged my signature on documents that transferred ownership of investments my parents had left me into his sole control. We discovered that the mansion, which I'd believed was in both our names, was actually only in Richard's name because he'd had me sign a quitclaim deed years ago under the pretense that it was for estate planning purposes, and I'd trusted him and signed without reading it carefully. We discovered that Michael had been charging personal expenses to my credit cards for years, racking up almost $60,000 in debt in my name that I was legally responsible for. The forensic accountant's report was devastating in its thoroughness, documenting fraud, forgery, financial abuse, and theft that had been happening systematically throughout my marriage. James also hired a private investigator to document Richard's affair with Sarah. Within 2 weeks, we had photos of them together at restaurants and hotels, phone records showing hundreds of calls and texts, and a witness who'd seen them together at Richard's firm's holiday party the previous year, openly acting like a couple while I was still healthy and at home believing my husband worked late because he was dedicated to his career. But the most important thing James did was help me understand my actual legal and financial position. Through careful research into property records and estate documents, and the prenuptial agreement I'd signed when we married, a document Richard's lawyer had written, and I'd signed without getting my own legal counsel because Richard said it was just a formality, James discovered something Richard had either forgotten or never fully understood. The mansion might be in Richard's name alone, but I had significant rights to it as a spouse in our state, especially given that I'd contributed financially to its maintenance and improvement over the years. More importantly, my parents' inheritance that Richard had stolen and invested, those investments were still technically traceable to my separate property under state law. The life insurance policy Richard had taken out on me had been purchased with funds from our joint account, which meant I'd essentially been paying the premiums on my own death benefit, and the prenuptial agreement Richard thought protected him actually had a clause that invalidated it completely in cases of adultery or fraud, something his lawyer had apparently included as a standard protection that Richard had never bothered to read carefully. Everything I'd believed I'd lost, all the power and resources I thought they'd taken from me, it was still mine if I was willing to fight for it. And after 6 months of listening to them plan my death and celebrate my absence, I was more than willing to fight. I was ready to go to war. James filed the divorce papers on a Friday afternoon. Not just divorce papers, but a comprehensive legal filing that included adultery claims with photographic evidence, fraud claims with the forensic accountant's report attached, requests for restraining orders, motions to freeze all joint accounts, and a demand for full financial disclosure of all of Richard's assets and income. The papers were served to Richard at his office by a process server who walked right into a meeting he was having with senior partners. I knew the timing because I'd planned it that way, wanting maximum professional embarrassment, wanting his colleagues to see him receive divorce papers at work like he was some kind of cliché. James called me an hour after service and told me that Richard had called the office screaming, demanding to know what the hell I thought I was doing, threatening legal action, threatening me. James told him calmly that any communication needed to go through legal counsel and hung up. Then James called Richard's firm and requested a meeting with the managing partners to discuss the evidence we had of Richard's affair with a paralegal employed by the firm, a violation of their ethics policies that could result in termination. He didn't threaten or demand anything, just politely requested a meeting to discuss the matter, but the implication was clear. Richard's career was now at risk along with everything else. Michael was served with papers the same day. I was suing him for repayment of my inheritance money I'd spent on his education, claiming it had been a loan, not a gift, and I had records to prove the original intent. I was also suing him for credit card fraud for the charges he'd made without my permission, and I filed a police report for identity theft and fraud, providing all the documentation of the unauthorized charges. Amber received a cease and desist letter informing her that any further use of my credit cards or property would result in criminal charges. I had the locks changed on the mansion at 3 p.m. that Friday afternoon. When Richard came home at 6 p.m., his key didn't work. When he called my phone screaming, I didn't answer. When he threatened to break down the door, the security company I'd hired called the police, and he was informed that per the restraining order James had filed, he was not allowed within 100 feet of the property or me. He ended up having to go stay at a hotel, and according to the private investigator who was still watching him, he went to Sarah's apartment instead, and she refused to let him in because she'd just found out she was being fired from the law firm for the ethics violation, and she blamed him entirely. The next 72 hours were chaos of the most satisfying kind I've ever experienced. Richard's law firm put him on administrative leave pending an investigation into the affair and the questions about his personal conduct. Michael showed up at the house with Amber, trying to get in, and the security team turned them away, while I watched on the camera system from inside. Richard tried to access our joint bank accounts and discovered they'd all been frozen by court order. He tried to use the credit cards, and they'd been canceled. He tried to transfer money from accounts he thought were in his name alone, and discovered that James had filed liens against everything pending resolution of the fraud claims. Sarah called me, somehow got my number, and screamed at me that I was ruining her life, that Richard loved her, that I should just let him go gracefully, and I listened to her rant for 3 full minutes before I said very calmly that Richard had been planning to murder me for insurance money while he was sleeping with her. And did she really think a man like that was going to treat her any better than he'd treated me? Then I hung up. She called Richard and broke up with him immediately, according to the phone records we subpoenaed later. Michael hired a cheap lawyer who sent James a threatening letter demanding I drop all charges and lawsuits or face a countersuit for emotional distress. James sent back a letter with the evidence of Michael's theft and a reminder that he was facing potential criminal charges, and suggested Michael might want to consider settling quickly before this became a public trial that would destroy his reputation permanently. The legal process took 8 months from filing to final judgment, and it was 8 months of strategic moves and counter-moves that I orchestrated with James like we were playing chess against opponents who'd never bothered to learn the rules. Richard fought every single thing, dragging out the process, refusing to settle, convinced he could win because he was a lawyer, and I was just a stupid housewife who'd gotten lucky waking up from a coma. That was his first mistake, underestimating me one final time. Every move he made, we'd anticipated and prepared for. Every argument his lawyer presented, we had evidence to counter. The forensic accountant testified about the systematic financial fraud. The private investigator showed the photos and phone records of the affair. I testified about the conversations I'd heard during my coma, and while that evidence wasn't admissible in criminal court, in family court, the judge listened with an increasingly disgusted expression as I recounted what my husband and stepson had said about me while I was fighting for my life. James presented the emails about staging an accident, and while we couldn't prove Richard had actually done anything because the accident had been genuinely caused by a drunk driver, the intent was clear and disturbing enough that the judge commented on it in his findings. The judgment came down on a Tuesday in May, almost exactly 1 year after I'd woken up from my coma. I got the mansion outright, awarded to me as compensation for the fraud and financial abuse. I got half of all marital assets, plus an additional 40% awarded as punitive damages for Richard's conduct. I got spousal support of $12,000 per month for 7 years. I got reimbursement for all my parents' inheritance money Richard had stolen, with interest. Richard was ordered to pay all my legal fees, which after 8 months of aggressive litigation were substantial. He was also censured by the state bar for ethical violations and suspended from practicing law for 2 years. Michael settled out of court 3 months into the proceedings, agreeing to repay the college tuition money in monthly installments over 10 years, and admitting to the credit card fraud in exchange for me not pursuing criminal charges. Amber disappeared from his life the moment she realized he was broke and facing years of debt. Richard lost his partnership at the firm and his professional reputation. He lost his mistress, who wanted nothing to do with a disgraced lawyer facing financial ruin. He lost his son's respect when the truth about his affair and his planning came out. He lost everything that mattered to him, and it was all legal, all justified, all the natural consequence of his own actions finally catching up with him. If watching karma work through me gave you even a fraction of the satisfaction and vindication that it gave me to actually live it, to watch their faces as they realized what I'd done, to see them finally understand that actions have consequences and you can't treat people like garbage forever without it coming back to destroy you, hit that like button right now. Every single like tells YouTube's algorithm to show this story to more women who desperately need to know that betrayal doesn't have to be the end of your story, it can actually be the beginning of your power. Women who need to see that you don't have to just forgive and forget and turn the other cheek when people destroy you. Like this video right now, because stories of women taking back their lives, standing up for themselves, and refusing to be victims need to be seen by everyone, especially young women who think they have to accept disrespect to keep the peace. Like it now. I moved back into the mansion 3 days after the judgment was finalized, and the first thing I did was walk through every room and reclaim my space. I got rid of everything that reminded me of Richard, donated it or sold it, or in some cases just threw it away with deep satisfaction. I redecorated in colors I actually liked instead of the neutral tones Richard insisted on. I turned his study into an art studio because I'd always wanted to paint, but never had time when I was too busy serving everyone else. I hired a housekeeper, not to do everything but to help maintain the house while I focused on rebuilding my life, and I treated her with respect and paid her well, and we became genuine friends. I reconnected with old friends from before my marriage, women I'd lost touch with, and I was honest with them about what had happened and why I'd disappeared, and they welcomed me back with open arms and understanding. I started therapy to process the trauma of the accident, and the coma, and the betrayal, and the years of being slowly erased, and my therapist helped me understand that none of it was my fault, that I'd been systematically abused and manipulated, that recognizing it and fighting back wasn't vindictive. It was self-preservation and justice. I also started a foundation with some of the settlement money, a nonprofit that provides free legal assistance to women going through divorce who are being financially abused or manipulated by their spouses. I named it after my mother, who'd always taught me to stand up for myself, even though I'd forgotten that lesson for 20 years. The foundation has helped hundreds of women in the past 3 years, women who were in the exact position I'd been in, scared and powerless, and convinced they had no options. We connect them with lawyers and accountants and therapists and support groups. We help them understand their rights and their worth. We help them fight back and win. Every woman we help feels like I'm getting justice for myself all over again, like I'm taking the worst thing that ever happened to me and turning it into something that helps others. And that transformation feels more powerful than anything I experienced in my old life of service and sacrifice. As for Richard and Michael, I don't think about them much anymore unless someone asks, like I'm doing now telling you this story. Richard works as a contract attorney now, doing document review for a fraction of what he used to make, living in a small apartment, his reputation destroyed. He tried to contact me a few times in the first year after the judgment, wanting to apologize or reconcile or something, but I blocked his number and had James send a letter telling him any contact would be considered harassment. Michael paid back the tuition money for 3 years and then defaulted, and I had to take him back to court to garnish his wages, which I did without hesitation. He's working a regular job now, no longer the entitled trust fund kid he thought he'd be, learning what it's like to actually have to work for things instead of having them handed to him. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he tells people I'm a terrible person who destroyed his family over money, that I'm vindictive and cruel, and I don't care at all what story he tells himself to avoid taking responsibility for his choices. They both lost something they'll never get back, something more valuable than money or property or professional status. They lost my love, my loyalty, my forgiveness, my willingness to sacrifice myself for their comfort. And they finally understand, too late, that those things were the most valuable things they ever had, and they threw them away like trash. I wake up now when my body is ready, not when someone else needs something from me. I spend my days doing work that matters, helping women who were where I was, creating art that makes me happy, maintaining friendships that are reciprocal and genuine. I have conversations that energize me instead of drain me. I make decisions based on what I want and need, not on what will make someone else comfortable or happy. I travel when I want to, places I've always wanted to see. I take classes in subjects that interest me. I date occasionally, carefully, men who treat me with respect and see me as an equal partner, not a service provider. I'm surrounded by people who actually see me, who value my presence, not my usefulness, who appreciate me for who I am, not what I can do for them. My life now is smaller in some ways, quieter, less focused on appearances and status, and maintaining some perfect image, but it's mine in a way nothing in my old life ever was. It's authentic and real and chosen, every single part of it, and that makes it infinitely more valuable than the beautiful prison I used to live in. The thing nobody tells you about revenge, about justice, about finally standing up for yourself after years of being pushed down, is that it's not really about punishing the people who hurt you, though that's certainly satisfying. It's about freeing yourself from the prison of other people's expectations and manipulations and abuse. It's about reclaiming your power and your voice, and your right to exist as a complete person, not as a supporting character in someone else's story. It's about looking in the mirror and recognizing yourself again, seeing the woman you used to be before you started shrinking yourself to fit into spaces that were never meant to hold you. When I won my case and got my settlement and watched Richard and Michael face the consequences of their actions, I felt vindicated and satisfied and relieved. But the real victory, the one that matters most, happened later in quieter moments, when I realized I wasn't angry anymore, wasn't hurt anymore, wasn't waiting for their approval or apology or acknowledgement anymore. I was just free, completely, utterly, magnificently free to live my life on my own terms for the first time in 20 years. So let me talk to you now, directly, one more time before we finish. You who might be lying in your own metaphorical coma right now, conscious but powerless, hearing the people you love talk about you like you're nothing, watching your life be stolen piece by piece while you feel helpless to stop it. You who might have spent decades making yourself smaller so others could be bigger, silencing your voice so theirs could be heard, sacrificing your dreams so theirs could flourish. You who might be sitting there thinking it's too late, I'm too old, I'm too tired, I've invested too much to walk away now. They need me. What would I even do without them? Let me tell you some truths that took me 6 months in a coma and a near-death experience to learn. Truths I wish someone had told me 20 years ago. You are not too old to start over. 51 felt ancient to me when I was lying in that hospital bed. But I'm 54 now, and I've never felt younger or more alive or more hopeful about the future. You are not too tired. You're just exhausted from carrying people who should be walking on their own. And when you finally put that burden down, you'll be amazed at how much energy you actually have for things that matter. You haven't invested too much. You've invested in the wrong things. And the sunk cost fallacy is just another prison keeping you trapped in a life that's killing you slowly. They don't need you the way you think they do. They need what you do for them. They need your service and your silence and your sacrifice. But they don't need you as a person because they don't actually see you as a person. And when you're gone, whether through death or divorce or simply walking away, they'll find someone else to use, or they'll finally learn to take care of themselves, or they'll suffer the natural consequences of their choices, and none of that is your responsibility to prevent anymore. What would you do without them? Anything you want. Everything you've been denying yourself for years or decades. You'd breathe deeper and sleep better and laugh more genuinely and discover parts of yourself that you'd forgotten existed. You'd build a life that's actually yours, filled with people who value you and activities that fulfill you, and days that don't feel like endless obligations you have to survive. You'd be happy in a real, deep, sustainable way that doesn't depend on whether someone else is satisfied with your performance today. I know you're scared. I was terrified. I know you think you can't do it. I thought the same thing. I know you believe you don't deserve better, or that wanting better makes you selfish or ungrateful. I believed that lie for 20 years and it almost killed me. But here's what I learned, and what I need you to understand. Choosing yourself isn't selfish when you've spent your entire adult life choosing everyone else. Wanting to be treated with basic respect and appreciation isn't asking too much. It's asking for the bare minimum that every human being deserves. You are not responsible for managing other people's emotions, or protecting them from the consequences of their actions, or making sure everyone is comfortable even when you're dying inside. You are responsible for your own life, your own happiness, your own well-being, and if the people around you have a problem with you finally prioritizing those things, that tells you everything you need to know about whether they ever actually loved you or just loved what you did for them. The life you deserve, the one where you're seen and valued and cherished for who you are, not what you provide, it's waiting for you on the other side of the fear. On the other side of the guilt they've programmed into you. On the other side of the social conditioning that taught you your worth was in your service to others. That life is real and possible and closer than you think, but you have to be brave enough to reach for it. You have to be willing to disappoint people who have never worried about disappointing you. You have to be ready to be called selfish by people who have been infinitely more selfish in their treatment of you. You have to accept that some people will never understand or approve of your choice to save yourself, and their opinion has to matter less than your survival. I'm not special. I'm not extraordinary. I'm not some exception to the rules that bind you. I'm just a woman who got a chance to hear the truth about how the people I loved really saw me, who got pushed so far past my breaking point that I had no choice but to change or die, who decided that if I survived, I was going to make that survival mean something, and if I can rise from the ashes of complete betrayal and build a life better than I ever had before, so can you. The only difference between me and you right now is that I already started, but you can start today, right now, this moment. Make one phone call to a lawyer or a therapist or an old friend you've lost touch with. Open one separate bank account in your name only. Take one small step toward reclaiming your power and your life. It doesn't have to be dramatic or public or confrontational. It just has to be yours. One step, then another, and before you know it, you'll look back and see miles between you and the prison you used to live in, and you'll breathe that free air, and you'll know with absolute certainty that you made the right choice. The life you deserve is waiting. Go get it. If this story moved you, shook you, inspired you, or gave you ideas about your own situation and what you might be capable of doing, I need you to do 3 things right now before you click away. First, like this video. I'm serious. Hit that thumbs up right now so the algorithm shows this to more women who need to see it. Women who are suffering in silence right now, thinking they have no options, no power, no way out. Your like literally changes lives by making this discoverable. Second, subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications. And I mean all notifications, not just some, because next week I'm sharing the story of a 57-year-old woman who discovered her entire family had been planning for 3 years to declare her incompetent and take control of her multi-million-dollar business that she built from nothing. And what she did when she found out their plan will leave you absolutely speechless. It involves fake memory problems, strategic business moves, and a boardroom confrontation that ended with her children begging for mercy they didn't deserve and definitely didn't get. You won't want to miss it. And third, most important, comment below and tell me, what was the exact moment you realized you deserved better? What was the thing someone did or said that finally made you see clearly that you were being taken advantage of, disrespected, or taken for granted? Because your story matters, your voice matters, and this community is here to remind you that you're never too old, never too late, never too far gone to completely rewrite your ending. Share your moment in the comments right now. I read every single one, and so do thousands of other women who come here looking for solidarity and strength. Do all 3 things now, and I'll see you next week with another story of a woman who refused to stay down. Thank you for trusting me with your time and your emotions today. Now go take back your power